Cindy, very much for that introduction, and thank you to Lisa here, who has helped put this event together, working with Cindy and with our good friend Kathy Kilduff, who helped make the arrangements. It's great to be here today to talk to you folks and to know that people will be joining us via Zoom utilizing technology, and then the talk itself will kind of live on YouTube, so people will have a number of different ways of viewing it and seeing it over a period of time. It's a great privilege to be able to talk about my book, The President's Man. It took about 2.5 years to put this book together, and I get asked the question often, we're talking about events in here that happened 50 years ago. So why in the world have you decided now, 50 years later, to go put together a book? And so there's a couple of answers to that that may be of interest. Number one, I did it for historical purposes. I had been working out at the Nixon Library on the renovation of that facility. It has a wonderful exhibit area and a lot of the history from the Nixon administration. And in working on that project, I realized how little people knew about President Nixon. They have it characterized and put into two buckets. The buckets are either Watergate or he went to China and opened it up. And everything else that he got accomplished is kind of diminished, and with the media and so forth, has just not gotten the lift or the reporting on it that I felt would be incumbent upon me to try to bring forth to the American public, with telling the stories and the anecdotes and everything of the man that I knew. I had friends who said, Dwight, you owe it to history to do this. And I don't know whether I owed it to history or not, but it made sense to get it all down. And needless to say, I wasn't getting younger by the day. I was, putting on some mileage. So if I was going to do the book, I better get at it. The other factor that weighed in was we were out in Kansas City visiting my daughter and her family. And there was this little knock on the guest room door, and I opened it. And here is little Matthew. He was around 8 years old. And he looked up at me and he said, Pips. Now, my grandchildren call me Pips. That happened because they couldn't pronounce Gramps when they were little. So I ended up being Pips. And so he's looking up at me and he said, Pips, did you work for a president? And I said, yes, Matthew, I did. And he said, but didn't you go to prison? And I said, yes, Matthew, I did. And I invited him to come in and sit on the bed. And he looked up at me and he said, did the president go to prison too? And I said, no, Matthew. I said, it's kind of complicated, but over time, I would really be happy to explain all this to you, and we'll talk about it. So I am headed back to the New York City area, and I'm talking to my wife, and I said, Matthew's 8 years old. He didn't come up with this question or anything. He heard something. He had a bunch of cousins or whatever it might be, and I decided right then that the other reason I wanted to write a book was because I wanted my grandchildren and my future great-grandchildren to know what had happened to me. I wanted them to know a little about the man that I had worked for and the great privilege that I had to be a part of our government service. And even though I went through some rough times in Watergate, that, by the way, is an understatement, going through some rough times. But I wanted my grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know that not only what happened to me, but that I got through it and that rough stuff like that is okay. Adversity is a wonderful thing. You just have to travel through it and get to the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. So that's a little bit about why I wrote the book, for historical purposes and also for family. One of the participants here this afternoon said that she was very interested in authors and the process they use. And so I just want to take a second about the process on this book. I did have a collaborator. His role was to help me with the writing piece. Of course, I had all the stories. He didn't know that or have that information, but he was able to help get it put together. What we utilized was a technique where he interviewed me over 30 times for 3 hours each session. When COVID hit, we moved to doing it by telephone. The sessions were all recorded, and then they were transcribed. And the notebook that contained all of the information was like this thick, and I am not exaggerating. It had over 800 pages of text material that we worked with. I also had taken and kept diaries during my years working for Mr. Nixon and then President Nixon. And my diaries, maybe some of you have had this experience. I would start with all the good intention of keeping a diary, and then it would kind of taper off, and then something would happen or jolt me, and I would start back up again. But I had probably 5 or 6 different diaries that had pieces of information in it that really served to help juggle my memory. And then the last thing I had, well, actually I had 2 other things. I had Bob Haldeman, who was my mentor and had originally hired me. Bob Haldeman became Nixon's chief of staff and was very important in my story here in the book and very important in my life. Bob and I had exchanged letters over the years, and these were the years prior to Nixon getting elected president and during the whole campaign period, and then afterwards, even after we had both gone to prison. So these letters became incredibly important in terms of giving us kind of a framework of how we were thinking and, very importantly, how we were feeling. And Joe Haldeman, Bob had passed away, and his widow is one of the ones that provided that material to me. So I had all the letters he had written me and all the letters that I had written to him. And then lastly, the National Archives is absolutely phenomenal. They keep every single piece of paper. So all of my files, of which I had several hundred linear feet of files, were available to us. So the answer to our process was that we waded through all of this material, and through that process, it kind of jiggled my mind, and we were able to assimilate the incredible number of stories that are in the book. People that read the book are really blown away by the number of stories that we have and some of the insights that are present in the book. Lastly, I do want to go back to my collaborator for 1 second, and that is that he did something that was really very important. I didn't understand at the time. He would ask me as we proceeded through the material, he'd say, "Dwight, when that happened, how did you feel? What was going on inside of you?" And of course, that was so important, because when he did that to me, I would have kind of a tingling sometimes on my spine, or my heartbeat would pick up as something that was kind of sad was talked about or whatever. And So I believe that in this book, there is a lot of heart. And that is due to my collaborator and how he was able to get me to think back on that and bring that forward. Let me say a couple of words about President Nixon and then make some other comments, and then we'll go to questions and answers. I'd be thinking of something. If you want to ask me, I'm happy to respond to anything. There's no subject that's not manageable here, and I look forward to any questions that you might have. Yesterday, a man by the name of Robert McFarland passed away. He was 84 years old. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy. He was a very distinguished American. He got into trouble when he was in his early 40s. And he, at that time, was National Security Advisor to Ronald Reagan. And I'm telling you this story because I think it gives you something that most people don't know and an insight into Richard Nixon. So in his 40s, mid 40s, and he died at 84 yesterday. So he's basically halfway through his life. And he gets involved in the Reagan administration in the Iran-Contra affair, which was a scandal that hit the Reagan administration. It was complicated. I'm not sure I even understand all of the nuances of the Iran-Contra matter. But McFarland was to go testify to Congress on a given day. And about 6 hours before he was to go testify, he took over 30 Valiums and tried to commit suicide. And they put him into Bethesda Naval Hospital in Washington. So it was a very sad thing. This is obviously very tragic. He obviously felt that he had let his country down, he had let his president down, and that he had nothing to live for. So the interesting part of the story to me is this. Richard Nixon had resigned the presidency. He had gone to Southern California. He had moved back to Saddle River, New Jersey. He was in the process of writing his books and advising both Reagan and then Clinton and other presidents and so forth. But he hears about McFarland. So what does he do? He goes out and gets on an airplane with the guy that was kind of doing his security. He had turned down all Secret Service type help, but there was a man that traveled with him. And he took the shuttle up to, or down to Washington, D.C. and went out to Bethesda Naval Hospital and goes in and he sees McFarland. And he had known him because McFarland had been a young aide. He was part of the White House Fellows, which is a very elite group of people that's brought into the White House. And he was a White House Fellow during the Nixon administration and had worked in congressional relations. So his ties were back to Nixon. So Nixon goes into the room and he says to McFarland, he said, "I know how you feel, Bob. You made a mistake." He said, "You're a young man." He said, "I went out to California and it took me a while to adjust and then realize that my life was still ahead of me and get back on my feet and get at it." And he says, "That's what you've got to do. You can still serve your country. You can make a contribution. Look ahead, don't look behind." And I think that's remarkable. Richard Nixon had this resiliency. He had this attitude. He had this, whatever it is, Quaker, they call it, peace at the center. And what would kill most people, they would be so drugged down by that resignation process and everything that he went through, that they would never rebuild themselves like he did. And keep in mind, he was vice president of the United States, and he got hammered by Jack Kennedy. There's a question as to whether or not he even lost that election because of what happened in Chicago. Mayor Daley delivered votes for Jack Kennedy, and there was a lot of shenanigans. Lyndon Johnson, that's where he got his name, Landslide Johnson, was because he delivered Texas. He was the vice presidential candidate on that ticket with Kennedy, and he delivered Texas, and there was questions about the ethics of that election also. So Nixon had been down and out, and then he goes and he runs for governor in 1962 against Pat Brown in California. And so he's lost to Kennedy, he lost to Brown, and ABC has an hour show with Howard K. Smith, who was a commentator at the time, and it was called The Political Obituary of Richard Nixon. So this guy, vice president, runs against Kennedy, goes to California, and he's down and he's out. And what does he do? But he comes back again. He comes into the White House. He's president at one of the most tumultuous times in our history, which was Vietnam. He's having to deal with Vietnam, but he opens up China. He goes to Russia and he signs the SALT talks, which is the strategic arm limitations talks. His popularity is off the charts. He runs for re-election in 1972, and he carries every state in the Union except one, and we're here today, in that state. So he lost Massachusetts, he lost the District of Columbia, and then came Watergate and down. And you talk about being down and out, the resiliency of coming back again. And the message he was giving to McFarland when he sat there and said, the future's ahead of you. Nixon goes to California. His health goes to hell in a handbasket. It takes him several months to get his feet back on the ground. He then writes his book, a very famous book called The Memoirs of Richard Nixon, called RN for Richard Nixon. Moves back east and writes 9 books on foreign policy. He's an advisor to other presidents, and he rebuilds his life. When we were doing the Nixon Library renovation, there's a wall where we have where we depict the Watergate ending of Nixon, and down at the end of the wall is a quote from when he appeared on the David Frost show. He did an interview with David Frost, who was a very famous interviewer from London, personality. And this Frost interview, Nixon had like 3 or 4 different nights, an hour each night. It was quite, at the time, quite a well-viewed show. And at the end of the show, David Frost said, Mr. President, is there anything you want to say to the nation about Watergate? And we have the quote down at the end of the exhibit, and he says, I want to apologize to the American public, but most of all, I want to apologize to the youth of the country for what may cause them to be cynical about their government and our process, because the important thing is that the young people believe in our country and believe in our government. So he said that on national television. The way that we have the exhibit in California, after you read that, you kind of turn a corner, and there's a huge cover of Newsweek, and that's been blown up. And it says at the top, "He's back," and it has a picture of Nixon. And I love it because had he not done that down at the end, where he apologized to the country and he took responsibility, in my opinion, the Newsweek cover of "He's Back" would never have happened. So I'm kind of prejudiced. I'm not kind of prejudiced. I'm very prejudiced. I really respected the man. I thought that he had qualities that of empathy with people, that he in his heart of hearts was a good man. He's rough on the tapes, but that he wasn't thinking these are going to be released to the public. He uses language that if it's true, some of the language that's being used in the White House now, he was mild compared to some of the language that I'm hearing about, but Nixon was weighed on a different level. Nixon was not popular with the media. Nixon was not a Reagan-esque type personality. He was more of an introvert. He had that beard, you know, his skin was basically translucent. He would shave in the morning, and an hour later, it looked like he needed to go shave again. I mean, it was just the way he was built, and that was used by the political cartoonists to draw cartoons of this characterization of this guy that had some kind of an evilness. So, you know, we had to fight all that. I talk about it in the book. I mean, it's a fact of life. It's what we had to deal with. Let me give you one more story on the president that gives you a clue as to what he was all about. And it's John. Is it John? John. It turns out that John here, who came in today, who I must say I don't remember being with, but he was on our trip to Europe, a couple of trips, and worked at the State Department and was involved in the State Department side of the presidential travel, and worked for a very good friend of mine by the name of John Thomas, who was very high level at the State Department, and actually controlled all the funds. When we would go on a trip, John Thomas would have suitcases full of money. Is that true? It's true. I mean, in today's world, you'd say, what? Suitcases full of money? There's got to be something illegal about this. But John Thomas would carry this money around, and you walk into his hotel room and there'd be all these stacks of $100 bills and so forth, as he, by the way, that it was all legitimate. The money is being used to pay for hotels and for all of the various services and so forth, and that was the responsibility of the State Department. Well, anyway, back to my story. We're on our way to Rome, and the president knows that we're going to go be seeing the Pope. So he says to his military army aide, every branch of the service has a aide assigned to the president. So there's a naval aide, marine aide, so forth. But the army aide was Vern Coffey, great guy. And he says, Vern, I want you to go through the plane and identify with the pilot, Ralph Albert has it, identify who among the crew, the Air Force One crew, who is Catholic. Vern does this. So it's about a day and a half later, and it's in the morning at the hotel, and we're getting ready to go to the Vatican. And the president asks me to find Vern. And Vern goes in, and the president says, Vern, will you get in touch with the people that were identified on Air Force One crew that are Catholic, and have them provide transportation and have them meet us when we get to the Vatican. So we go over to the Vatican, and I must admit, I'm not Catholic, but this was one of the great moments in my young life at that time, was to be up there and to have the President of the United States introduce me to the Holy Father and so forth. And my Pope gave me a little medal in a leather case. I mean, it was a big deal. And so the staff was done first, and then the president said, Holy Father, I'd like for you to meet some other people. And I'll never forget this rather young looking, he may have been older than he looked, Filipino steward from Air Force One, who was Catholic, who is standing there with tears streaming down his face as the President of the United States introduces him to the Pope. It was just an unbelievably powerful moment. And no one had said to Richard Nixon or something, here's an idea you might want to go do. This was something that he knew that people that were Catholic would want the opportunity to be able to do something like that. And I like telling the story because I think it exemplifies, just like the McFarland story, it exemplifies some of the goodness about the man himself. We did a lot of great things in the Nixon administration. We opened up China. The strategic arms limitation talks were signed. OSHA was created, the Occupational Health and Safety Administration. The Environmental Protection Agency was established. The 18-year-old vote was put in place. The all-volunteer Army came about. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. Nixon was an incredibly progressive president. Some people say there was a book written by a good friend of mine, John Price, who said the last liberal president. That's the title of the book, The Last Liberal President. I don't think Nixon would like the title, but the point is he was a very pragmatic man. He was not pulled apart by ideological beliefs. He was problem solved. He was, how are we going to solve this? How are we going to deal with this? How are we going to bring everybody together? Keep in mind, when he passed all that legislation, it was, he was president, the Republican. Both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House, were both under Democratic control. So it was imperative that all these people get along, and they did, and they met together. They got together weekly. Every single week, the bipartisan leadership, the Democratic side, the Republican side, came and sat in the Oval Office with the president to decide how they were going to handle legislation. Today, in today's world, if they come up to meet with the president in the cabinet room, it's like national news. Back then, they were doing it on a very regular basis. So it was an entirely different experience back there. Everything was rolling along nicely. We come up to Watergate. Maybe some of you will have some questions about that. Logically so, because we're on to the 50th anniversary of Watergate. It was horrible, heartbreaking, and disastrous. Any other adjective you want to throw in there. The president made some poor decisions, and his staff made some poor decisions. But the single most important thing to have in mind is that when the break-in happened in June of 1972, through till March of 1973, that's 9 months, 9 months, his counsel, John Dean, never told the president what he, John Dean, knew. And John Dean had been there from the start. He knew about the planning for the break-in. He knew who was involved. And he meets with Nixon continually through this period and never tells Nixon the truth. And in this book, the back of the book, we have the transcript from March 20th, where most people focus on Mr. President, there is a cancer on the presidency. That's the most famous piece of that conversation. But the other part of that conversation is Mr. President, there's some things you don't know that I should tell you because you're going to have to deal with them. It took him 9 months before the truth started coming out to Richard Nixon. So that does not excuse presidential responsibility or any other responsibility. I'm not trying to use that in a defensive way. I'm just saying that the president was lied to by his lawyer, the person that they thought they could trust. John Ehrlichman, who was the head of the domestic council, talked to Bob Haldeman, who was the chief of staff, and they agreed on a phone call the day after the break-in that the investigation would be led by John Dean. And they did not know that the wolf was in the hen house. And that is an important part of this book. It's explained fully. I give I think a wonderful account of how Watergate happened, and I've been complimented on that by the way that we have tried to really simplify it and make it very clear as a reader goes through here as to what happened. So if you have not read the book, obviously I encourage you to do so, so I will now cease and see if we have any questions from any of you. Yes, sir.
I'm not sure I ever knew or heard anybody talk about what the burglars were after when they broke into the DNC at Watergate. And I think this is sort of a general feeling of what that might have been, something against the DNC, I suppose. But I've heard a lot of other explanations about what they were really after, and I'm curious what you would say that they were really after in breaking in there.
Okay, terrific. And of course, that's an incredibly important question. When Nixon heard about the break-in of the Democratic National Committee, his reaction was, how stupid can they be? If you want to know what's going on, you break into the headquarters of a candidate, not into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. And that's in the book, and it's well documented that that's what he said. The conventional view is that they were in there to try to get dirt on Larry O'Brien, who was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. They may have been there to do that. I cannot say definitively. I can tell you this, that the month before, in May, they went in and they put bugs. And it turned out that the bugs that they had put in to record conversations in May were garbled and not that strategically were not in the right place. So it was decided that the information that they were getting was so mixed up that they were going to go back in again. John Dean, who had been provided the information from the May thing, knew they were going to go back in again. He may not have known the exact day that Gordon Liddy was going to take his troops back there to go in, but John Dean knew they were going to go back to get the mics into better places so that they could hear what was transpiring. Jeb Magruder, who was the deputy director of the committee to re-elect the president, is the one that said to Gordon Liddy, I want you and your men to go back in, relocate the bugs, and so that we get better information. So that's they're trying to get information. I can't get more definitive about it because I don't think anybody knows on that. Then there is another nuance. There is a conspiratorial type view that may not be so conspiratorial. That is that John Dean had a woman that he was dating by the name of Mo Bender, who later became Mo Dean, very striking, statuesque, blonde, Absolutely drop dead gorgeous. And Modine was, let me be careful here. It has been alleged that she was part of a call girl ring that was housed in the Columbia Apartments, not far from where Watergate was located. And that John Dean, who was dating her, knew that her name was in a black book that was in a desk, the desk belonging to somebody, Oliver's, I forget his first name. Eric, no? Anyway, into Oliver's desk. And one of the burglars, when they took all the stuff out of their pockets and everything, had a key to that desk. So, and that's all been reported. It's in books. There's books written about this. So what John Dean was trying to do was to get a hold of the black book because he was in love with this woman and he didn't want her associated with a call girl ring and so forth and so on. John Dean sued Lynn Kolodny, who is a writer of a book called Silent Coup, because Lynn had the story I just told you in the book, in his book. And Lynn, before he died recently, sent me all the court papers where the case that Dean tried to make against Kolodny and sue him was dismissed by the judge, and Dean backed out completely. So Dean did not press the legal side of that, which was almost a form of admission, if you want to interpret that way. Now, I'm sorry, sir, that I can't be more clear about this, but that's what I know. Long answer, right? Yes, sir.
Does any of this information which you just relayed to us appear in your book?
Yes,
That's the first part of my question. Yes or no?
Yes.
Have you been sued by John Dean in any way?
No.
Because Liddy was.
Right. Right. I have not been. John Dean, when asked about my book, his comment was, he didn't have.
He didn't have a dog in the fight.
He did not have a dog in this fight. My bride is in the back row. Let me say this, that this book is published by William Morrow, and that is owned by, that company is huge, and it's owned by HarperCollins, this is one of the top publishers in the country, if not the world, but one of the top. So the general counsel, every word in here went through lawyers. God only knows how many times. The general counsel of HarperCollins called me last August. And he said, Dwight, I was 13 years old when Watergate happened. He said, I watched every minute of it on television. He said, I was spellbound. And of course, that's true of any of us of that generation. We all know it captivated the country. Everybody kept saying, what's going to happen next? You know, he said, in reading this book, he said, I always, before I read it, I felt that John Dean was a whistleblower, but a good whistleblower. He says, I've changed completely my viewpoint on John Dean. And he congratulated me. And he gave me a word, which was really an important thing because this guy is a lawyer. And I had characterized Dean in different ways. One of the most important being an FBI document I found where the FBI, in their analysis of all the Watergate thing, they called him, and I have the document in the book, they call him the master manipulator of Watergate. Okay, but this guy, the lawyer, when I talked to him, said, I think you should use the term that he unfaithfully carried out his duties to the President of the United States. Because you got to think about this. John Dean is the general counsel to the President of the United States. His lawyer, his top lawyer, for 9 months, and it's all documented. he does not tell the president the truth. He unfaithfully served the president of the United States. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You know, I just like to read a lot about World War II. So, and obviously, you didn't know Nixon during World War II. But do you ever talk about his days during World War II?
He sure did.
I'd like to hear a little.
And if you go to the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California, you'll see a large exhibit that we did on the war. There's a couple of things about it that I only know about because of the work I did on the exhibits and so forth. But one that again speaks back to the man himself before I get into it, is that every day he wrote Mrs. Nixon and he numbered the letters. And every day she wrote him and she numbered the letters so that they would make certain that they didn't miss a letter from one another. And these are really love letters back and forth between these two young people. Nixon was in the South Pacific. There is a picture. The picture says Dick's Burgers. He with some of his pals, they put together an old-fashioned hamburger stand for troops coming through. And Nixon's work was on the mechanical side of keeping equipment going. He volunteered, and he volunteered, but he volunteered where he would not be in active duty because he was a Quaker, and Quakers didn't believe in war. And so he served, but he did not serve in battle. And he had friends from that period of time that it's interesting when he got ready to run, well, first for the Senate, but especially for the presidency, all against Jack Kennedy. And Jack Kennedy had all, the PT 109 crowd and that ire about him, but all the Nixon people that would always talk about Dick's hamburgers and so forth. And that group came together to help support Nixon. Just one other little aside while we're on that subject of war. One of the most heart-wrenching things I think I saw at the very start of the administration. We had been in the White House maybe for 2 months, 2 or 3 months. So this is 1969, and let's just say it's early spring, maybe April or May, maybe like right now. And my buzzer went off. And so the president had three buttons on his phone, on the right-hand side of his phone. That were little buttons. And it was Holderman, Rosemary Woods, his secretary, the steward, and the steward would be somebody he'd push and they would come in and bring coffee, or if he had a guest in there, he would ask them if they wanted something to drink. And then the last button was Chapin, that was me. So, and I pop up and go in. And my office was between the cabinet room and the Oval Office. So, I'm just right bang in the Oval Office. So I go in and he's standing in front of his desk. So he had to have reached down to push this button. As I got there, he put his hand out and there were these tears. And he said, "Will you please give these to Rose?" Rosemary Woods was his secretary. And what was in his hand were handwritten letters that he had just written to parents that had lost their kids in Vietnam. And he was crying. And what really grates on me, I have to be honest here, what really grates on me, and we're starting to see some of this in some of the stuff, a couple of the stories I've read in the last 2 or 3 days, where they're rehashing Watergate. And they're making the point that Nixon was so political that he even extended the war in 1972 so it would be active to help him get more votes and so forth. I mean, it's just like, that is so foreign to the man that I knew and to how I think he felt, let alone Henry Kissinger. I mean, we haven't even touched on Henry here. I've got a ton of stuff in here about Henry. And these are men who were trying to end the war. When Nixon walked into the door, there were 510,000 troops in Vietnam. When he resigned and left, which was right before the peace accords were executed, it was down to like 6,000. So it's not like he didn't do something. I mean, he was trying to get that thing over with, and we've got demonstrators going on right outside the ellipse. We've got, no joke, we've got 300,000 or 400,000 kids and some adults, but younger people, anti-war people marching around that. We've got buses nose to nose all around the ellipse, trying to keep them away from the coming over the fences and stuff. I mean, it was a rough time in America. You know, we think we've gone through some rough times lately and some controversial times. It was bad then, believe me. Yes, sir. John.
It's actually Phil. I thought you were trying to remember John Thomas's name.
Yeah.
The cash was what they would bring with Lyndon Johnson when he would take the paintings off the wall of presidential suites and hotels. John Thomas would have to pay the hotel in cash to make up for the president's.
To get Lyndon Johnson's painting on.
But then I was also apologizing for being one of the people outside the White House demonstrating against you back in those days.
Well, don't apologize.
But the question I want to ask is, Nixon is both there's his Southern strategy for the '68 election.
Let's talk about it.
And Nixon, as Evan Thomas's book describes him being basically the father of affirmative action.
Of what?
Affirmative action was a Nixon creation, and then in 1953, he was recommending that federal contractors be required to make positive steps.
Right.
The hiring more blacks, and then Schultz and
Mitchell.
Mitchell and Hodgson, Schultz's successor at the Labor Department, Hodgson.
Oh, Jim Hodgson.
Yeah, I mean, they kind of forced the AFL-CIO to desegregate the union. So I mean, this sort of Southern strategy and affirmative action doesn't make sense to me. I was wondering what you saw during the election. Was there a Southern strategy, or is that just part of the myth?
Okay, so this is a very interesting question. I'll try to shorthand it. Yes, there was a Southern strategy. Nixon wanted to build a strong Republican Party in the South. The way that's presented by the media, when you say Southern strategy, they want that to be translated and that it's racist. I mean, the South gets whammed all the time for being more racist. Well, they were back in the days. If you wanted to go look at the Democratic senators from the South, I mean, they were full of guys that were in the Ku Klux Klan. Lyndon Johnson could have never passed the civil rights legislation without Everett Dirksen and the Republicans. Nixon had a great relationship first of all, with Dr. Martin Luther King Sr., and then with Martin Luther King Jr. I have a story in here about going to the funeral. I was in Ebenezer Baptist Church for the funeral of Dr. King with Mr. Nixon. Now, so the Southern strategy thing, I think, is BS. There was a Southern strategy. It was to build a strong party in the South. The interpretation of that is, particularly among Democrats, is, Nixon's coming in and doing racism or something. It's not true. Nixon was not a racist. Based the desegregation steps during the Nixon administration were incredibly consequential. They didn't do it under Johnson. They didn't do it under Kennedy. Nixon took, when he took the schools in the South were 85% segregated. When Nixon left office, it was down just under 10%. And what they did is they would invite groups of leaders. This was what you're referring to as the Schultz, John Mitchell, Nixon formula. And I have it detailed in here. They would invite from communities the leadership up to the White House. So you say to leaders in the state, would you like to go to the White House and meet with the president and have a meeting? They don't say no. They say yes, and they come. So they would get the contentious groups to both come, and they would park them in the Roosevelt room. And now we go to the good cop, bad cop thing. Mitchell would walk in first, and Mitchell would say, folks, we're here today. We have an issue that needs to be solved. It is the law of the nation that we get rid of this segregation. And we're going to figure out how to do it. And you here are among the keys to this. And so he would set it up and he would leave. And in would come George Shultz. And they would spend 4 or 5 hours, started working on ideas as to how they would go back and forth. And let's say that this started at 9 in the morning. At 1 o'clock, we had it set for Nixon to go in. Nixon said, go in there and he'd say, I know you folks are dealing with one of the hardest problems in your local community. So he had to give the empathy to what was going on and the change that he was expecting from these people. But he, and I'm so happy you're here and we're, stay at it. We'll get this worked out and I'll see you later this afternoon. And then he would leave. And then Mitchell would come back and Schultz would be there and the lawyers would come in and whatever had to happen. But over and over and over again, by the end of the day, community by community by community, they shifted this thing and people started accepting what they were going to have to do. The only place they really had an issue that they couldn't get undone was in Louisiana. And Nixon gambled on that one and took Mitchell, Schultz, himself, and everybody, and they went down and had the meeting in the capital or wherever they did it down in Louisiana. And they finally got that one turned around. But I mean, he worked really hard on that stuff. And so I find the Southern strategy thing mainly advocated by people that want to take a swipe at Richard Nixon. There's no question he had a Southern strategy, and he had it because he felt that he wanted to build a strong Republican Party in the South. And thank God in these elections that we've been having, that we have a strong Republican Party in the South. Yes, sir.
Do you get into much detail on the Saturday Night Massacre?
No, I do not get in much detail on the Saturday Night Massacre because that did not affect me directly. By that time I had left. I was one of the first people to leave. I was the first person to go to trial. I was a victim of the Saturday Night Massacre because what happened is that the original Watergate prosecutors came to the conclusion that I was not indictable. When the Saturday Night Massacre happened, Leon Jaworski came in as a result of that. And when Jaworski arrived, they needed to have somebody they could put forward as fast as possible. Unfortunately, yours truly was the sitting duck. And they came after me my phone rang, my lawyer, I have a very good lawyer. He said, Dwight, they're going to indict you tomorrow. This is a few weeks after the Saturday Night Massacre. They're going to indict you tomorrow unless you agree to be a witness against Bob Haldeman, who was the chief of staff, or President Nixon. I used very language that I can't use in here, because of TV, but I told them to just, go do something to themselves. And I said, and make it clear that the reason I'm not negotiating at all is I don't know what those people did. I was involved in something called the Dirty Tricks activity. It was a minor part of Watergate. The only reason that it became so important, as we've put forth in the book, is it became important because I was one of the ways that they could get to Richard Nixon and get to Haldeman. I had never been as close to the president as I became once the press started realizing that my name was around there and they could tie me to Nixon and then get into the White House. I'll add this viewpoint of Nixon's, and it ties back to the David Frost interview and so forth. At the end of the process of his writing his book and doing these interviews, President Nixon, former President Nixon, was interviewed, and he called Watergate his last campaign. He said it was my last campaign and I lost. And the importance of that is the psychological side of what was going on in his head, which was, this wasn't criminal, this was a political thing. He never viewed himself as a criminal. There were people that committed crimes, but he himself viewed it, and I would say that I definitely view it, and I state that in the book, that this was a political event, and people made bad judgments, horrible mistakes. There was criminal activity at the committee to re-elect the president. You're not allowed to go break in buildings and so forth. But the president's intentions were never to have criminal aspects of this tagged to it.
There was a question on Zoom. One of our participants asked, did Nixon hate Jews?
No, I cover that in my book. I spend quite a bit of time on the subject of Jews and blacks and the tapes. And the problem is the tapes, and the tapes read without understanding the man and the times, and let me just say, and going back 50 years, the way that we would talk about things or do things could lead one to believe that Nixon was either anti-Semitic or a racist. And that is not fair. I point out that we had an incredible number of wonderful and very talented Jewish people that worked directly with the president. First and foremost, obviously, Henry Kissinger, Ellen Greenspan, who you all know from when he dealt with the head of the Fed later in life. Stein, who Stein was the head of the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Jeff Donfeld in the drug program. Jaffe in the drug program. Bobby Green, who handled domestic affairs for John Ehrlichman. Bill Kilberg, who, it's on and on and on. Very talented Jewish people of Jewish faith, let me put it that, who worked in the Nixon administration. They sure as heck didn't quit and leave because they thought that he was an anti-Semite. Yeah, this is one of my favorite things when somebody comes up to me and starts talking about how horrible Richard Nixon is. The best example of who started talking to me about how horrible Richard Nixon is, I was at breakfast with Carl Bernstein. And, I had met him out in East Hampton, New York, where we were going for the summer on a beach house. And I ran into him and I said, why don't we have breakfast or lunch? And so we got together and we would have these, we got together several times and we'd have these conversations and he would, you know, tell me how evil he thought Richard Nixon was. And, you know, I would push back because I didn't feel that he was an evil man at all. But there is this cadre of people that put forth this type of information or state that they believe that Nixon was this or Nixon was that. They've never met him. They're getting it from books. The people that are writing the books, for the most part, have never met him. And they're taking it from the tapes because that's a critical source that we have. And those tapes, we don't know whether those tapes, if you kept listening to it, would exonerate Nixon because they take and use these little clips from tapes. So I'm sure you folks understand that, you know, if you go out and do an interview, for example, I spent CBS was at our home in Connecticut for 8 hours the other day. They taped me for 4 hours. They're going to have a documentary special on Watergate that's going to be aired in June. And I'm on there with some 2 or 3 other Nixon people. And they're putting us juxtaposition of Walter Cronkite. Guess who's going to win this one? So we're going to have Walter Cronkite telling us how the Washington Post and Walter Cronkite and so we saved America from Richard Nixon. And then you're going to have our side of the thing where we're trying to explain what the guy was all about. We'll see how it all turns out. But I'm hopeful that what prevails through this work and through what a number of other people I know about are doing, I hope that what prevails is us getting closer to the truth of it all. Our side, needless to say, we're prejudiced. We have our view. There are other views contrary to how we look at it. And of course, in history, the name of the game is to try to keep sifting this till we get as close to the truth as we can possibly get.
We have 2 more questions. Let me just look at both of them so you'll know. Question number 1 was, what was Dwight convicted of? And question number 2 was, did Nixon interfere with peace negotiations between Johnson and Vietnam? I've read a number of books about President Nixon and get different versions of that story.
Yes, that's huge. That's huge. So I was convicted of making false and misleading statements to a grand jury. And the reason I was convicted for making false statements to a grand jury, by the way, when I was asked the question, do you remember this particular piece of literature? And I was not shown, I was asked about it, not shown it. I was asked, I said, not that I recall. And I was convicted for not that I recall. I was also convicted for not to the best of my recollection. Those were the 2 statements that I went to prison for, spent 9 months in prison, and nobody ever showed me the documents or anything. My view is that in my heart of hearts, when I went to the grand jury, I had absolutely no intention of lying. My parents had raised me to respect the FBI, to respect law enforcement, I grew up in Wichita, Kansas. I was from the Midwest. I was not geared to be, as a young person, I wasn't geared to be duplicitous or to misrepresent things. And I was called into this grand jury. When I walked out, I said, oh, they asked me how it went. I said, oh, it was terrific. You know, it wasn't that bad at all. I mean, I was so naive. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I walk in there, they're asking me these questions. I have no idea that the question can be construed so many different ways and could end up entrapping me. And the name of the game was not to get to Dwight Chapin. The name of the game was to get to Richard Nixon or Bob Haldeman or John Ehrlichman or John Mitchell. So I was convinced to answer the question that came in. I was indicted for false and misleading statements to a grand jury. Now, the second question happens to be a very hot one, and it's very complicated. The simple version would be this. In 1968, Nixon is running against Hubert Humphrey. The charge is that Nixon and John Mitchell worked with a woman by the name of Anna Chennault. Anna Chennault was an Asian, married to General Chennault, and very tied to the South Vietnamese government. And the charge is that Nixon and Mitchell and Anna Chennault, or Anna Chennault being the agent, went to the South Vietnamese and said, don't participate or don't reach agreement in the Paris Peace Accords because Nixon will have a better deal for you than Johnson had. Then Johnson was putting forward. So that, and so therefore the charge is that Nixon derailed the Paris peace talks in order to get himself elected president. So when we're renovating the Nixon library, we are dealing with this subject. And thank God, the National Archives said that they would pick 4 historians, and that the 4 historians, that independent of one, I mean, these weren't friends of, they all knew each other, but I mean, they were, we had no contact with them, and basically the archives went out and got them. That these 4 historians would unanimously, all 4 had to agree on every word that went into the Nixon library. So that we would have our library done in a way that was beyond repute. They took this issue of regarding Anna Chennault and Nixon and the 68 election, and they examined it. They came to the same conclusion that Teddy White, who wrote the book, The Making of the President in 1968, the same conclusion that Teddy White came to, and the same conclusion that Hubert Humphrey, who was Nixon's opponent in 1968, came to. And that was that this incident could not be proven one way or the other. So what we did at the library is we put down everything from the quote Johnson point of view. We put down everything by the Nixon point of view. There's 2 sets of documents when you walk up to the table. It presents the issue, it presents the documents, and you as a citizen of this nation can go and read both sides and see if you can decide which one it was. But the historians couldn't even decide themselves. So they came up with this solution for us to use. So that's my answer to that question.
Thank you.
A long answer, but yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I heard recently that Nixon was involved in helping Israel during a wartime in the 70s. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you tell us a little bit?
Golda Meir called him our president. The 6-Day War, I believe, or something. I'm not an expert on this. It's foreign policy, but Nixon was always pro-Israel. It's part of what I lay out in the book in regards to his issues with people of Jewish faith. He got royally pissed off when somebody like Senator Javits from New York would come in. Javits came in right before Golda Meir was going to visit the United States. We get a call from Javits' office. He wants to come in and get his picture done with the president and so forth, because Golda Meir's coming and there's going to be all this attention and everything. And Nixon's reaction was, he wants to come in and get a picture now, but where's his support when I'm, sending jets to Israel and I'm doing this and I'm doing that? And it's all so political. And, but Nixon never wavered from supporting Israel. His issue was with people that would come in and tell him he had to support Israel, he has to support Israel, the Jewish League and all these people would come in and then and talk to him that way in the Oval Office. And then they would go out and get on television or talk to the press in front of the White House West Wing, and say the president needs to be doing more for Israel. And in his mind, he's doing all of this stuff. And so it was very contentious. Sloppy answer, but it was contentious. Anybody else? Well, folks, I want to thank you very much. I think we're at the end of our time. I appreciate your coming. To those of you that are watching at home or wherever, thank you for watching, and I appreciate it very, very much.